Andrew, today I want us to consider what Jordan Peterson has to say about Moses and the Exodus in chapter 7 of his book, We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine. Please help us understand what Peterson is up to in this chapter, and then give us your critical analysis of his project here.
Awesome. So this might be the biggest chapter of the whole book. I think it's something like, I didn't do the math, but it felt like 100 pages. It's probably like 90 or something. It's a long chapter. So there's no way I'm going to be able to point by point go through and break down the entirety of what Peterson's talking about in detail. So we have to now, I think, instead move to a sort of frame it in terms of, and this is appropriate given Peterson, we need to frame it in terms of the two narratives that are at work within this. Now, I just got back from a conference. The conference was the LAC conference this year, and Slavoj Žižek spoke there. And there's Todd McGowan, a pretty big theory guy. He introduced Žižek, and he said this. He says Žižek is going to be speaking, and he's going to be speaking on a whole lot of new stuff that he's been working on. And here's the thing about that. That means that because he's still working on these ideas, there's going to be a lot of tangents. And of course, Žižek then just sort of says, "This is war. How dare you say that about me?" Because everybody knows that Žižek gets lost in tangents all the time. Well, this book is like that 100%. This chapter in particular. At one point, there's a whole digression on Richard Dawkins, where he just sort of airs his beef with Dawkins and so forth. And as far as I could tell, there really wasn't, other than just kind of, I guess, a kind of moment of anti-materialism or something like that. There really wasn't much of a purpose of a lot of these digressions. So we can probably leave those digressions and tangents for the most part alone and focus on two main points that he's really getting at, two main narrative points. So the first one is going to be, well, maybe we should actually say three. Let me back up. We should say three. All right. So the first one is going to be analyzing Moses as the hero. By the end of the chapter, he's analyzing Moses as the judge, the good judge. And in between, there's the struggle of the hero and the arch villain or the evil king, and that's going to be Pharaoh. So we're dealing with Peterson's take on the Exodus narrative, the Moses narrative. And the important thing about that is, by this point in the book, any reader will probably have realized that Peterson isn't so much putting forth a thesis as much as this almost becomes a commentary, like just a running commentary on the scriptures, which of course ends up giving him the excuse for all of these tangents that he sort of falls into. And the thing about all of that ends up being that it's not like this is actually just like Peterson has a thesis statement where he says, I want to talk about heroes, judges, and villains, basically. He doesn't ever do that. But if we read the chapter, I think we can abstract effectively that these are the three archetypal positions that he's going to be trying to focus on. Mostly on the hero, secondly on the villain, thirdly on the judge, in that order. So that's the order that I'll proceed. All right, so in the beginning on page 320 with the chapter, he really just kind of introduces this broad brushstroke statement. If you'll remember from the last chapter, he has the line where he openly says that the Bible is about us. All of these stories are ultimately about us. So in the opening gesture on page 320 is really just to say that we're all heroes, and this is going to be an archetypal story of the hero. And it's well worth contrasting this with Abraham in the last chapter, because Abraham, I think, as a narrative could be better compared to some story like, I guess, the Odyssey or the Aeneid or something like that, right? Wherein it's a journey narrative. Whereas the Moses narrative ends up kind of getting there by the end of the chapter, but for the most part, it ends up being the hero versus the villain narrative, right? There are villains that pop up in Abraham's narrative. In Moses's, there's one tyrant, Pharaoh, that he's fighting against. And so as sort of a meta theme, you have the hero who must first free his people kind of story. He brings up, of course, his favorite movie, The Lion King, as another parallel. He brings up as well Harry Potter and so forth and so on, right? Like you have the standard collection of stories that'll help bring this to the fore.
Pinocchio.
Pinocchio, all the same ones. Yeah. And so with this, you have the hero's story essentially framed as first a revolution, and then it asks the question, what do we do once we've succeeded in the revolution, right? Now, again, I mentioned that I went to a talk from Žižek last week, and Žižek has this wonderful meditation that he's always bringing up, and he talks about how he likes the movie V for Vendetta, wherein you have the Great Revolution that takes over in England at the end of the movie. But then he always said that what he really wanted to see was V for Vendetta 2, which is to say, what happens after the revolution occurred, right? Because all the really interesting stuff occurs after the revolution, when people have to deal with the consequences of their actions effectively, and they overthrew the power. Okay, well, what power are you going to put in its place? And so the first part is the revolution here. V for Vendetta 1, I guess you could say, is what we're in right now for Moses. And if we're all heroes, we have kind of a general motif that you can kind of recognize from the earlier chapters in the book, particularly the one on Abraham. Namely, Moses encounters the fiery bush, or the fire. I think Peterson calls it as well the flaming tree a few times. But the idea is this is going to be the call to adventure, the standard motif that we've been seeing throughout the book, the call to adventure. And Moses is kind of secure in a sense. He's kind of comfortable, and then he gets called to come back and fight against the great, or lead the uprising against the great enemy, the evil king. And so it's an interesting point, because the bush is explicitly said on page 325 to point to a kind of transformation, right? That the fire in the bush is taken symbolically to point to a kind of transforming power. And this is really all getting at what God is going to be revealed as in this chapter. God is going to be revealed as being and becoming. Now, he's already said this in the book. And so by this point in the book, while that you could in a sense see this maybe as like we're getting to the penultimate chapters, right? At the same time, this is also going to be the most redundant section of the book, because he's already dealt with God as being and becoming. He's already dealt with all of these major themes. Now we're just seeing them unfolding in a new story. One of the most important stories now being, of course, about Moses. And so the bush ends up sort of representing the voice of God here is the call to adventure, which is, of course, also going to be manifested as the God of being and becoming, which is going to come back later when we deal with, he has a wonderful reference to Aquinas. We'll end up getting into that in just a minute. But so Moses gets called, there's a very similar sense in which he talks, Peterson talks about how Abraham gets called out from his life of comfort into a life of action. And then here Moses is getting called out from a life of relative security to a life of literally toppling the king kind of deal. So we have that general narrative. But then, of course, Peterson shifts gears and he brings up the villain of the story, the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh, if you've been following Peterson, you won't be surprised to hear this. The Pharaoh represents tyranny and totalitarianism. So there's this standard villain of the totalitarian dictator that needs to be overthrown, that basically is the wrong form of a hierarchical kind of ruler, right? And so Moses represents the right kind of hero, kind of coming to topple the wrong ruler and replace him. And so the Pharaoh is going to be the villain. The villain doubles down on his own law. He mistakes himself for the highest principle. He doubles down on that principle and refuses to let go of that principle. And so Moses is going to be contrasted with that. And God comes to Moses and even tells Moses, I'm going to harden the heart of Pharaoh. And this is an interesting point for any theologian, because this is going to be, especially if you follow a kind of high providential view of God, which, all classical theists will do, if you're a Calvinist or a Thomist or whatever, right? The point here is that God is actually operating behind both Pharaoh and Moses here. And God is telling Moses, you're going to sort of feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall effectively, because I'm hardening Pharaoh's heart, but I'm also going to overcome him. And so God equips Moses to overcome this villain who he's told up front will double down, will fight him to the end effectively. But of course, God will overcome that villain. Now, there's a couple of further symbolic things about what God equips Moses with. And sorry, checking the time, making sure I'm not going too long. So he equips God, or God equips Moses with a staff, for example. This is the staff that turns into the serpent when Moses encounters the Pharaoh's magicians. And this staff, Peterson says, represents something like the cosmic tree, for example. And this cosmic tree is yet again, wait for it, Jacob's ladder. And that Jacob's ladder point is if there was, you almost could, this book, instead of We Who Wrestle with God, you could just about call it Jacob's Ladder. That'd probably be a pretty legitimate title. because this shows up everywhere. And when we get to Aquinas, it shows up there too. It's kind of funny. But anyway, so the point is that this staff represents Moses' connection with the divine and his following of the divine. And so he has to encounter the tyrant and lead his people to a kind of freedom. But here's the question: what kind of freedom are we going to be led into? And so once we've successfully pulled off the revolution, the question of what kind of freedom really presents itself. If you remember from the Abraham chapter, there's a point that Peterson has made a couple of times, and that is that the tyrant represents perhaps a kind of unity. It's a faux unity, but it's a unity nevertheless. And so we can become satisfied with this faux unity, that it at least harmonizes things. Peterson, in I believe the Abraham chapter, talks about how in Soviet Russia, for example, or in post-Soviet Russia, polls would be done wherein the older generations would sort of pine for the days when Stalin was in charge, keeping order, right? And to us, of course, in the West today, or even just really in the 21st century, we kind of hear that and go like, how in the what? Why? How in the world would you pine for the days of Stalin? And that's because he represented a kind of faux unity. And that once you overthrow even the faux unity, the question still ends up being, yeah, but what kind of unity are you going to replace it with, right? What are you going to produce in its stead? And so freedom is always going to be freedom within a structure. The question is it the right structure that keeps the divine way, the God of being and becoming, the moral order at its core, or is it going to be one that just simply operates on power? In terms of power, Peterson says this, I believe, explicitly. Where does he say it? It's on page, I might be missing it. Yeah, I don't think I wrote down the page number. Rats. Anyway, so the point is that, it's page 351. That's the page. So the point is then that we need to have freedom within the proper structure, which has the right authorities following the right laws, ultimately following God. And so God, of course, here being the highest principle of unity and also the lawgiver, the one sort of who's sovereign, i.e. outside of the judgments of law. And so he ends up being the principle that's also sacred and therefore unquestionable, right? That the wrong view that Pharaoh ends up representing is going to be the tyrant who elevates himself to the place of God. And so anybody who's ever critiqued false powers by saying these guys are, they have a God complex, Peterson's on that view, right? They elevate themselves to this highest point. And so therefore, instead of having a sort of rational moral goodness that governs this system, instead it's just going to be power all the way down, And so the question for authentic power becomes a big one in the third part of the book, in the latter part of this chapter, rather. And so the authentic power, again, is going to be following God as being and becoming, and recognizing that that order is produced out of chaos, and chaos still may even maintain itself in order, that there's this kind of yin-yang thing that he brings up. So for the Christian reader, this is going to probably be a more uncomfortable point, right? Because there's a sense in which he reads the Christian view of the law as being in some ways intertwined with a Taoist philosophy. And so we can comment more on that later. The point is, for him, it really is reducible to this standard thing that he's been talking about, which is chaos and order, the balancing of chaos and order. And so whether you find that part objectionable or not, again, we can get into that later for the viewer, but that's essentially what he's getting at. But the question, though, he raises a very fun question here, and that is, after overthrowing the tyrant, God does finally overthrow the tyrant. He does a kind of fun section where he analyzes the plagues, showing what they symbolize and how each one of them is designed to sort of show that even the priests, the phonies of power, cannot actually replicate the true power of God. And so eventually God just breaks them with these plagues. And he even breaks the unyielding tyrant with the final plague. Peterson talks about that on page 356 and 357. But the question ends up being asked on 357, why, though, after breaking the tyrant, why do we not go straight to the promised land? And again, for those who are readers of Peterson, you should be pretty well aware of where he's going to go with this. The reason why we don't go straight to the promised land is because the journey in between is what matters the most and what actually makes you who you will be. And so it's really, again, it's not the destination, it's the journey. That's kind of really the point. I mean, to be a little bit trite and reductive on that. And so he gets at this point saying that essentially now this is us entering into the V for Vendetta 2 period. Right, we have to actually order ourselves appropriately, and here's where Peterson, I think, shines the most in terms of his commentary. His earlier part on Moses versus Pharaoh kind of gets a little too, I think, abstract. Maybe that it's a lot of statements about how you have gestures towards this abstract notion of God that's a little bit fuzzy. And how following God is the right way and not following God and following yourself is the wrong way. There's a lot of gestures like that. But when you get to the law, you get to I think, the meat and potatoes of what Peterson's really getting at. And that is, first of all, if tyranny is going to be like the bad thing that needs to be avoided, then what is the good thing? Well, the good thing, following the proper hierarchy, would be that we have diversified powers. Right. So Moses, he says, should not be doing this alone. Moses should be getting other judges to help him administer this order. And so you have a kind of also humility that necessarily arises when power is diversified, because no one person is going to be able to just lord over everyone per se, full stop, without any restrictions. That would be the tyrant. The person who is supposed to be the good leader is the one who knows how to compromise with others, who knows how to balance with others. The interest of this group is able to be balanced with the concerns of this group. And so there's going to be a harmonious order that he ends up producing. But then Peterson points out on page 376, this isn't just a self-creating order, that there are three main things that threaten any order along these lines. And that is, the first one is going to be a kind of exteriorized apathy, or exteriorization of one's own duty, which then will breed apathy, which is to say that when Moses is constructing this new set of judges, the new unity, the people might just say, all right, he'll be our moral core and we don't need to worry about this. And they'll just exteriorize all of those concerns to him and they will become apathetic. The next is, if that's done, well, Moses might very easily become a tyrant, right? That the threat of tyranny is just going to be this reintegration of Moses mistaking his own way for God's way. Why? Because he's not balancing his views with the concerns of the people, but rather he's lording over them. And then thirdly is that this, of course, would breed egotism and pride in Moses and the leaders. And Peterson, of course, is going to say that this is of course what we need to avoid. That's really what Pharaoh represented. That's how he behaved. And so it's no good if we just simply replicate that. And so to try to wrap it all up at the end, we move finally into the section on law. Now, for Protestants, this is huge, right? For us Reformed people, any discussion of law is going to be central to your set of concerns. And that also means we're going to be incredibly picky on what we're going to accept as a good presentation on the law and a bad presentation on the law. And for Peterson, the law ultimately represents nothing really particularly salvific in any traditionally theological sense. Particularly as well, if you remember from the earlier chapters, salvation is really just kind of, you raise good kids and those kids themselves turn out to be productive people and they raise good kids. And, that's kind of really more what salvation is ordered to. For the Christian, it's considerably different, which means then that from the very beginning, this discussion on law is kind of bound to rub people like me wrong, because the question of sacrifice comes up on page 399. And what is a sacrifice for him? Well, a sacrifice is really sort of literally giving over or giving something that you value for the sake of bringing a kind of social unity together. Now, if sacrifice is ordered towards social cohesion, there's certainly, I don't want to say that that's an unwise position. Yes, compromise, for example, would be just what we really mean by sacrifice here, right? And that's a good idea. Yes, we need to be people who can compromise and who can give up on some of our values for the values of others. And, for social cohesion, we need not to just dominate and lord over people. And so the practice of sacrifice is definitely a good heuristic for that. However, that's just simply not the point of sacrifice in the Old Testament, or for that matter, in Paul's remaking of it in the New, right? And so then that also sort of leads into the question that the people of Israel recoil from God, and they're just amazed that him giving the law doesn't kill them. At one point, they literally exclaim, please stop speaking, lest we be consumed by your all-consuming fire. And so the point is that they're recognizing the law will consume them. Well, so Peterson asked the question on page 185, well, why do they recoil like this? And I think his answer, to sort of wrap up my summary here, is kind of interesting and kind of telling. So he has this big section earlier in the book on the importance of depth beliefs. And so their depth beliefs are more or less these kinds of foundationalist beliefs, right? Let me see if I can give you the page number where the verse shows up. Deeper meaning, yeah, page 329 is when he introduces this sort of deep meaning points. And these are sort of the things, he gives the example of a husband and a wife, basically, where, imagine if one of the spouses cheats on the other, more or less the foundation of the marriage suddenly drops out. And so the base is no longer there. The deeper unity is no longer there. And so all of a sudden they're just left aimless in a sense. Right. And so what Peterson is pointing to here in this sort of idea of a depth issue, he gives a great phrase actually on page 329 as well. He says, if fidelity vanishes, everything shakes. Right. That's the line. Everything shakes. And so, think about if a foundation crumbles, so too does the building. That's kind of really what we're dealing with here. And so what occurs when God gives the law is he's giving, in a sense, a new foundation. And that's the terror of the law here. And so he writes that we have already established, this is page 385, he says, we have already established that there is little, if any, difference between what is deep, between on which much depends, and what is sacred or holy. In many ways, this is a matter of mere definition. There is a category that applies to the most fundamental presuppositions of the hierarchy of presuppositions that prioritizes our attention and sequences us and arranges our actions. There is proportionate emotion associated with shifts and movements and changes in those depths, ranging from unbearable exhilaration to at worst terror. Some things make very little difference to us on what. Sorry, the page is curving. Some things make very little difference to us one way or another, while others strike us deeply. If we are hit hard enough in the heart, if what is profoundly important and fundamental makes itself manifest to us, it is unclear that we can withstand, or that we can withstand the upset. And so really what he's pointing to is that some of these beliefs are going to be so fundamental to our way of life that if in giving the new law, they are undone, that we are ourselves going to be broken and shattered by them. And so the death the Israelites are fearing doesn't strike me as a physical death here, right? It strikes me as more as just like a psychological devastation of, wait, everything that I held and valued is no longer actually valuable. What am I to do? Right? It's more along those lines, which I think from a properly reformed perspective, the death that they were actually fearing was actual literal death, right? It's death. If it's symbolic death, it's actually the symbolic death of being separated from God and experiencing his absolute judgment. That's what they're really worried about there. But nevertheless, for Peterson, it's just that, this might literally break us if we have the entirety of our foundation upended. And so that's really the broad brushstroke of the chapter. That's about, like I said, 90 pages as briefly as I can go through them. There are a couple of points I wanted to bring out in terms of commentary. The main one, of course, being I can't look over the Aquinas reference. I have to go there. I'm terribly sorry. If you're listening and you're not a Thomist, I'm terribly sorry. This is for me. Sorry. Anyway, so the thing about the Thomist is, if you're not a Thomist, if you've only maybe encountered Thomism, in a broad sense, and you're still a little bit unsure of what it is, the Thomistic discourse is something that I remember when I first encountered it, it seemed like the most vertiginous mountain I'd ever seen, right? Like it was just such a rich terminology, such a dense terminology. I just figured I'm never going to get this thing down. And I've heard a number of people express frustration with it for precisely those reasons. And for, people like Anthony and me, like we've spent years of our lives trying to figure this discourse out. And so when you finally, though, actually mastered the discourse, what I find to be kind of interesting about it is it requires not just learning terms, but internalizing them. And it becomes so integral to who you are that when you start talking in that register, it can become very difficult to actually distance yourselves from the terminology so that then you can further break these terms down for people that aren't familiar with them. And so it ends up being essentially a discourse breakdown for us, right? Like, it's a very serious problem. And that's part of why I think it's frustrating for people that are listening to Thomists to try to figure out, what are these guys saying? Because you'll ask me, what is being? And I'm going, I mean, it's a basic term for me now. I don't know how to break it down further, right? So there's things like that just essentially that will limit us in our ability to communicate. And then there's great people. If you are listening and you really want a great communicator on Aquinas, go to Ed Feser, Feser, Feser. His stuff is just amazing. You read his blog if you want to see Thomism applied. Read his books if you want to hear Thomism explained. He's probably the best door in to Thomism if you're looking for that. But that being said, Aquinas shows up in Peterson's discourse, and here's where, as a Thomist, I'm about to do that Thomist thing, wherein I hear him use some terms, and I go, "Wait, hold up, that's not what that means, though. That's just not it, man. You missed it." And we can be. Were you about to jump in on that?
No, I'm just agreeing with you.
Yeah. It's entirely. I kind of sometimes hate to do that because I don't want to dissuade people from actually delving deeper into Thomism. It's very well worth your time. But the thing is, he reads Aquinas as, wait for it, Jacob's ladder, right? So he gets to God, and he talks about God as basically the actus purus of the classical theistic position is ultimately going to be the highest point. And here's just sort of in a way, let me try to be as generous as I can, right? In a way, he's committing a fallacy that I've actually seen a number of Thomists commit, all right? And that is to say that he views the ladder of the Jacob's ladder principle as being essentially the same as this great chain of being that the medievals talk about. And so the mistake of the great chain of being is the idea is that as you abstract further and further and further, you go from like a particular material being to now the formal being to now just pure idea of existence. And eventually you get to this idea of esse communa, which is the Latin basically for just the common mode of being of all created things, right? Everything that exists is created, exists in this, it partakes in this kind of existence, right? And the thing about that is that's not God. Right? God is what's called ipsum esse subsistens, which is self-subsisting being, self-subsistent existence, which means he exists of himself. Nothing brought him into existence. And esse communa is the kind of being or existence held by things that are brought into existence. And so there's a categorical split there between the two. And you don't just abstract your way to get to God as ipsum esse subsistens.
That's
you
right.
get there by a leap of causality. God is
That's
just
right.
a fundamentally different kind of cause. And so the error is for a lot of people that they think when they're first encountering Thomism that you just abstract your way. When you get to the highest abstraction, that's going to be God. And I hate to put it to you this way, but I'm terribly sorry. If that's your view, then you're a pantheist. Right? You haven't made it to God yet. You've made it just to the abstract form of created existence.
You've made it to philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. You haven't yet crossed over into theology.
That's right.
And so Peterson, by linking God to this to this great chain of being with the Jacob's ladder kind of thing, is committing that error. And here's the thing: to be generous to him, as generous as I can be here, I've seen Thomas do this repeatedly. It's an easy mistake to make. So if you're not a Thomist, I'm not surprised. I know I made that mistake for a few years when I was still trying to learn this.
As did I.
Yeah, and it's a big issue. And so once you kind of make it past mistakes like that, then you start realizing that's when you kind of really know the discourse. Really,
that's right.
And so Peterson's not a Thomist. He's never claimed to be a Thomist. He's had gestures in the past that we've talked about where he has Thomistic sounding language, or he could be synthesized pretty easily with Thomism. He's also had other places where he's deviated pretty far.
Sure.
But that being said, he's not a Thomist. So whether he gets this point or not isn't really essential to his claim. He's just right, though. I'll praise him for this. He's right to note that what he's talking about on page 334 is God's statement that I am that I am. Yes. Moses comes to him and he says, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God says, "Tell them that the I am sent you." And so Aquinas has a lot to say on this. This is basically God saying that he is ipsum esse subsistens, that he is self-existing being. And with Peterson, you have to remember he doesn't hold the same notion of being that Aquinas does. And that's going to be properly and adequately taxing out the differences between the two would be more than just a video on its own, but it still is something that, broadly speaking, just for the listener, if you're not familiar with what that is, for Peterson, there is some sort of, you would almost call it transcendental in the Kantian sense, in the sense of being is a kind of principle for consciousness. Right, it's the being of things. In a sort of Heideggerian register, you could say that it's the presencing of things in consciousness. And so the thing for Aquinas is that existence is, first of all, extramental. It's beyond the mind. It's out there, right? And so it's not just extramental, but that there is the entirety of reality is not just simply reality as known, and it would continue to go on as it is in the essential way that it is, whether we know it or not. Right? He is a realist, and so within this, you have an order to being, which is extramental. And if we understand the order of being and we abstract to the highest point that we can abstract, and we recognize that that highest point is a contingent created being, then guess what? That demands a cause beyond it, which is going to be the uncaused cause of God, which means that God isn't just beyond consciousness. He's actually, in a sense, beyond direct experience. Right? We experience his effects in creation. We do not experience him directly in terms of our daily sort of, my material experience, right? That you do experience him in a sense, you could say, in terms of your own sustained existence, because that is continually linking you with God. But you don't really, when I'm talking with Anthony here, I'm not experiencing God directly. I'm experiencing God as he's causing Anthony to be. Right?
Now, also, I think for the listener, it's also important to say that you can experience God through an act of God's grace, whereby as a Christian, you can experience the presence of God, but this is really part and parcel of God's self-disclosure. It's not as if you're experiencing the very being of God, but you're experiencing some gracious disclosure of himself to you in relationship. So you're not denying that.
No.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm just giving the metaphysics. That's going to be the theological addition on top of which that, like you're saying.
I was just trying to get in front of a criticism that someone could have if they're hearing you say that.
Right, exactly. I appreciate that. So for Peterson, actus purus is actually going to be sort of this highest principle that orders our lives.
Yeah.
I hate to be reductive like that, but that's kind of really what it's going to be. He's going to probably say something like it orders reality, but still, again, reality is going to be this affixed to consciousness here, affixed to the Lebenswelt of the human. And so this is not really going to be the same actus purus as the extramental mode of existence that God is for the traditional classical theist.
Yeah.
And so,
well, in Peterson's defense, it's almost impossible to gloss Aquinas. It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible to just bring up Aquinas, talk about him for half a page, and get him right.
Right.
So, in his defense, what he tried to do was nigh impossible. So,
yeah.
And all things considered, he came close, but as you said, he ends in something like common being rather than in being itself.
Right. And so that would be, again, a criticism. That's me. I've done my Thomist thing. I've washed my hands now of this, so I don't have to worry about this. But yeah, so in terms of the, actually, I probably have gone on too long because I know that we have a hard deadline here. So that's essentially this chapter with both commentary and criticism there of the Thomistic point. And so, yeah, that's essentially my summary.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing about this little section where he brings in Aquinas. One of the problems, he kind of handicaps himself because before he talks about Aquinas' view of God, he's talking about Taoism, right? Mm-hmm. The yin and the yang, this kind of dualistic understanding of ultimate reality. And for him, ultimate reality, I don't know, it seems to me to be dualistic for him because he wants to talk about ultimate reality as consisting of both order and chaos, right? Yeah. And then the divine is what orders the chaos. Okay, so that's very dualistic, very Eastern. And there's a sense in which you can say, okay, well, that sort of kind of maps on to this idea of esse commune in Aquinas, common being, because we know that for Aquinas, the basic principles of all being are act and potency. Yeah. So I'm not saying it's a direct overlap between this idea of the yin and the yang and this dualism, but as you said, that's as close as Peterson gets in his understanding of Aquinas, and what he misses, and that miss is so critical, because if he could really see what Aquinas is saying, I think it would really help Peterson out a lot. And that is that God is not to be identified with common being. God is the cause of common. He's the transcendent cause of common being. So God himself is not an admixture of act and potency, as are all beings. Rather, he is pure act itself. And even though I believe Peterson even used that term, actus purus, in the book in that section, he doesn't understand what it means. So, but most people don't. So it's not like this is not casting shade on Peterson. But anyway, so you said it perfectly. He ends like the ultimate expression of the divine for Peterson seems to be just common being. And that's why he's stuck on this notion of the primordial nature of both order and chaos, right? So that's a really good insight.
Well, I appreciate that. It's one of I was actually in a conversation over the last week with a really, really, really sharp scholar. And one of the things I thought was actually, this showed up in two different conversations. I thought was kind of interesting that two different people I was talking with brought up Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence. And they brought this out to be sort of against an essentialist view of humanity. And this isn't just a tangent so much as I think this is a good way to illustrate sort of the breakdown in conceiving of existence. We've kind of been conditioned to think of existence in terms of like some kind of an already anthropomorphic conscious mode of existence, right? And I kept emphasizing that when Sartre says that in his letter on humanism? No, that Heidegger's letter on humanism. It's the Existentialism is a Humanism essay. When Sartre says that, the fuller quote is, "In man and in man alone, existence precedes essence." Now, the immediate Thomistic recourse, which I think should also be somewhat self-evident, is that we should say, well, yeah, but what is this thing, man? Right? It seems like there's this pre-existing thing, this pre-existing form, if you will, called man, that has a particular condition such that in this particular condition that's already shaped, existence precedes essence. And so by essence,
there's potencies, there's powers that pre-exist that are required for one to define their own essence.
Exactly. And so what you have here is that this essence is now reconceived as really more what like Freud would call personality, right? Like what the character that I am to become is essentially going to be wrapped up in this. And because there's been a lot of sort of structural thinking that sort of made us like wrap things like gender and so forth up in that, unfortunately, the lines can kind of get blurred with what the more traditional realist would claim. But to speak just in that traditional realist register, essentially what this is pointing to, what Sartre has essentially said, is that there, kind of implicitly and unintentionally, is that there is this thing called human. What I would call the human essence is this statement of man. In man and man alone, existence precedes essence. Well, you've already identified what I'm calling essence when you point to man. And so we can debate, the proper modes of personality formation after this, but you haven't gotten away from essentialism. Now, to be clear, Peterson is not anti-essentialist. He is an essentialist, but he's more of an essentialist in the sense of, I think that there is a proper form for consciousness that we need to work to. And so he actually, his mode of essentialism would still actually, I think, be more on the personality side of things, not on the man side of things, right?
Interesting.
And so existence for him is still going to be like this conscious kind of existence, where for the Thomist, it's going to be, no. It precedes the conscious kind of existence. Rather, existence is this, it is the act of God causing us to be before we be as anything in particular, to kind of speak in a overly rigorous Thomistic fashion. Essentially, that existence for the Thomist does precede essence, but that's because I first am essa, right? I'm first am a being, an acting thing, to then be refined into a specific mode of being, which is my humanity. And then as a human, now I have this thing called consciousness. And now that I have this thing called consciousness, only now are we starting to get into what somebody like Peterson and a lot of the people that I was talking about are usually discussing as existence. Because for them, we're talking about this mode of consciousness as a mode of existence that now is ordered towards some set of tasks.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So what Peterson thinks he's referring to when he's talking about essence is really just personality. It's downstream from the metaphysical notion of essence, which is primary. Right. That's a good point. Well, let me just point out one more thing before we close here, and it's in this chapter where Peterson kind of gives his own argument for the existence of God. Now, I don't remember if he explicitly says, I'm going to give you an argument for the existence of God, but I have heard him in interviews that he's done in various media where he says what he says in this chapter is, in fact, his favorite argument for the existence of God, and he thinks it's a powerful one. And what's funny about it is it's something that springs from what Richard Dawkins says in one of his books. And so Peterson, let me summarize this quickly because we are out of time here, but Peterson basically agrees with this idea from Dawkins that organic beings are microcosms of their environment. And so that if a super knowledgeable biologist in the future, let's say we found a being from some distant planet and we have them here in our laboratory, Dawkins makes the point that if you have sufficient knowledge and technology, you could actually infer what the environment of this creature was just by how this creature is made, how they've developed evolutionary. And you can even see the ancestral environment in kind of the lineage, the physical lineage of this creature, right? So Peterson loves this in Dawkins. He thinks Dawkins has hit upon a deep truth, and he thinks that Dawkins isn't even aware of the depth of the truth that Dawkins has stumbled on. Because Peterson, he wants to say, yes, Dawkins, you're absolutely right. The nature of creatures tells us something about the broader environment that in which we live. But he wants to say, Dawkins, you are leaving something out when it comes to human beings, though. You are intentionally screening off anything except that which is material. But Peterson said if we really want to think about the nature of human beings, we have to include what he calls the intuition of meaning, existential apprehension that we have, even the fact that we have this thing called conscious experience. And within our experience, there's intelligibility. And like I said, meaning and purpose and personality and personal relationships. And so it's just funny because Peterson takes this argument from Dawkins and he pushes it further. He says, if Dawkins is right, and he thinks that he is, then from the fact that human beings also have conscious awareness, intelligibility, meaning, purpose, personality, relationship, well, then what should we infer? He said we should infer that wider reality, the environment in which we live, is also suffused with these things. If Dawkins is true, if we are microcosms, then ultimate reality must have intelligibility, it must have meaning, it must have personality, it must have consciousness. And he even says it must in some sense be personal. And so it's just really funny what he does with Dawkins here. And it's not like he doesn't offer us a philosophically refined argument, but he does take what Dawkins says and pushes it to its logical conclusion, given that we recognize that man is more than just material, that there is something spiritual about man in terms of his consciousness and, like I said, his understanding and intelligibility and so forth. So anyway, I wanted to point that out. It's very interesting, and if you listen to Peterson, he'll often refer back to this argument. I think I've heard him say, like, an argument from consciousness is what he calls it. So I just wanted to flag that.